In the sweltering, airless summer of 1856, deep within the humid wilderness of rural Texas, there existed a dark tradition that the local aristocracy simply called the Midnight Gauntlet. To the outside world, Deadwood Creek was merely another sprawling plantation, but to those who lived in its shadow, it was a graveyard of hope. This was no mere competition of speed or stamina. It was a meticulously scheduled massacre, a form of blood-soaked theater designed to entertain wealthy men who had grown weary of their lives of opulence. These were men whose fortunes were built upon the agonizing labor of others, and they sought to cure their boredom with the ultimate thrill, the hunt of a human being. Once a year, during the 3 nights of the new moon when the sky offered no light and the earth felt like a furnace, planters from across the South converged on Deadwood Creek. They arrived with pockets overflowing with gold and souls that had long since been emptied of humanity, ready to wager on the life expectancy of the desperate. The rules of the Midnight Gauntlet were as uncomplicated as they were barbaric. Each night, 10 enslaved men were untethered and released into the suffocating depths of the cypress swamp at exactly 9 p.m. They were given a 15-minute head start, a cruel window of time intended only to prolong the chase and heighten the entertainment. At 9:15 p.m. the hunters would set out. These were white men on high-bred horses, armed with the finest rifles money could buy and accompanied by packs of hounds specifically trained to track and tear human flesh. The wagering began weeks in advance, with cold calculations being made on how long the fastest runner would survive, how many bodies would be fished out of the muck by dawn, and which master possessed the most resilient property. In 7 years of this horrific sport, not a single soul had ever emerged from the swamp alive. 70 men had been cast into that green hell. 70 men had perished by bullet, by fang, or by the slow, silent swallow of the quicksand. Their names were erased by the morning mist, forgotten even as the house staff scrubbed the gore from the master's boots. The architect of this misery was Judge Horatio Thorne. He had inherited the 3,000-acre estate from his father, along with nearly 150 human beings he viewed as nothing more than biological machinery. But Thorne was a man who craved stimulation beyond the mundane reports of cotton yields and tobacco harvests. He had conceived the gauntlet in 1849, following a drunken wager with neighboring planters about the navigational skills of their stock in the dark. What began as a whim soon evolved into a legendary event in the shadowy circles of the Southern elite. It was discussed with reverence over cigars and fine brandy in exclusive gentlemen's clubs, though it was never whispered in polite society where northern abolitionists might catch wind of it. The swamp itself was the judge's greatest ally, a 2-mile by 3-mile labyrinth of black water, twisted cypress knees, and apex predators. It was a place where a man could vanish and never be found, and under Thorne's watch, many had. However, in the 8th year of this ritual, the judge made a fundamental miscalculation that would cost him everything. He operated under the arrogant assumption that the men he sent into the swamp were entirely broken, creatures so consumed by terror and exhaustion that they were incapable of thinking beyond their next breath. He never imagined that they could communicate, let alone organize. He certainly never suspected that the very people who shined his silver and served his meals were the silent architects of a conspiracy. The catalyst for this change was a man named Elias. He had been purchased by Thorne in early June for the bargain price of $800, a steep discount from the usual $500 for a man of his age and strength. Elias's reputation as a difficult worker had lowered his market value. He had attempted to escape twice from a Louisiana estate, resulting in 200 lashes that had turned his back into a permanent map of scar tissue and defiance. To the overseers, Elias appeared defeated, a man whose spirit had finally been crushed by the weight of the lash. But beneath that mask of compliance, Elias was a master of observation. He had learned from his previous failures that freedom achieved in isolation was a fleeting illusion. True liberation required a collective strike, a movement where no brother or sister was left in chains. During his first week in the cotton fields, Elias overheard the overseers laughing about the previous year's gauntlet. They joked about a man who had been cornered by dogs within the first hour and another who had drowned while trying to hide in a hollow log. They spoke of the $20,000 betting pool with the casualness of men discussing the weather. Elias said nothing, keeping his head bowed and his hands moving through the white fiber, but his mind was already mapping the plantation, counting the guards, and identifying the leaders among his peers. Elias spent his evenings in the cramped, dirt-floored cabins of the slave quarters, listening to the rhythms of Deadwood Creek. He identified the key players: Gabe, the massive blacksmith with hands that understood the soul of iron; Cato, who tended the horses and knew the swamp's hidden paths better than the judge himself; and old man Abram, who had survived 15 years of servitude and remembered every detail of the previous 7 hunts. Elias didn't rush his approach. He established himself as a silent, efficient laborer, allowing the overseers to grow complacent. Invisibility was his greatest weapon. By the time the moon began to wane toward the end of June, the foundation for the uprising was already being laid in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. The hunters believed they were preparing for another night of easy sport, but Elias and his inner circle were preparing for a reckoning that would redefine the meaning of the hunt. As the date of the 8th Midnight Gauntlet approached, the atmosphere at Deadwood Creek grew thick with a different kind of tension. Judge Thorne began welcoming guests from as far as New Orleans and Charleston, their carriages clogging the drive and their laughter echoing through the manor house. They brought with them the finest bourbon and the deadliest weaponry, oblivious to the fact that the property they were so eager to hunt was no longer waiting to die. Elias looked at the 9 men who would stand beside him on that fateful night, and in their eyes he saw a reflection of his own resolve. They were no longer running toward the swamp to escape. They were going in to wait. The 8th year would not be a race for survival. It would be the birth of a legend. The hunters were about to discover that when you strip a man of everything, you leave him with nothing to lose, and that makes him the most dangerous creature in the wilderness. The first crack in the judge's impenetrable wall came not from the fields, but from the manor house itself. Cora, a woman of sharp intellect who had spent 6 years polishing the Thorn silver and listening to the whispered sins of the southern elite, was the first to approach Elias. She moved through the quarters like a shadow, her presence as silent as the injustices she witnessed daily. One moonless night, she found Elias in his cabin, staring at the ceiling through the gaps in the rotting timber. She didn't offer platitudes. She offered information, the only currency that mattered in Deadwood Creek. Cora spoke of her brother, a boy of 16 who had been torn apart by hounds while the judge and his guests toasted to their winnings with imported brandy. Her eyes burned with a cold, focused hatred that matched Elias's own. She revealed the judge's routines, the heavy bottle of bourbon he consumed every evening, the exact location of the gun cabinet key behind the portrait of his father, and the deaf kennel guard who slept soundly through the night. This intelligence was the oxygen the conspiracy needed to breathe, transforming a desperate dream into a tactical possibility. While Cora served as the eyes and ears of the movement, Gabe, the plantation's master blacksmith, became its hands. A man of immense physical presence and even greater quietude, Gabe understood that the tools of their oppression could be reshaped into the instruments of their liberation. Beneath the constant, rhythmic clang of his hammer, a sound that provided the perfect acoustic camouflage, he began to siphon off fragments of scrap iron and discarded carriage bolts. Over the course of 8 grueling weeks, Gabe worked in the flickering orange glow of the forge to create a hidden arsenal. He fashioned crude but lethal blades, heavy-duty spikes and weighted chains, each piece filed to a wicked edge and tempered in the blood-stained soil of the estate. These weapons were wrapped in oilcloth to ward off the corrosive Texas humidity and buried in shallow caches around the property. To the overseers, Gabe was merely a valuable asset keeping the plantation's machinery running. To Elias, he was the armorer of a ghost army, turning the very iron that had once bound them into the steel that would set them free. The third pillar of their organization was Cato, a man who possessed an almost spiritual connection to the animals and the land. As the primary groom for the judge's prized stable, Cato was granted a level of mobility that others were denied. He used this freedom to map the green hell of the surrounding swamp with the precision of a surveyor. He identified the treacherous sinkholes that could swallow a horse whole and the narrow ridges of firm ground where a man could move with speed. Cato also studied the horses themselves, particularly the judge's $3,000 Kentucky stallion, noting their temperaments and their fears. He understood that the hunter's greatest advantage was their mobility, and his plan was to neutralize it at the critical moment. By learning the rhythms of the swamp's predators and the layout of its hidden waterways, Cato turned the environment from a death trap into a fortress. He was the scout who would guide them through the darkness, ensuring that when the chase began, the terrain would fight alongside the oppressed. Old Man Abram provided the historical perspective that Elias needed to anticipate the enemy's tactics. Having survived 15 years at Deadwood Creek, Abram was a living archive of the previous 7 gauntlets. He described the hunter's formations with chilling accuracy, the 3-pronged sweep, the release points of the hounds, and the judge's habit of watching from a raised wooden platform near the starting line. Abram remembered how every previous attempt at escape had failed because the men had run in isolation, driven by blind panic rather than a unified strategy. He told stories of men like Joshua, who had fought the dogs with bare hands for 15 minutes, serving as a grim reminder of what they were up against. This collective memory allowed Elias to build a counter-strategy based on the hunter's own predictable arrogance. They would not scatter, they would circle. They would not flee, they would wait. Abram's wisdom ensured that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, turning 70 years of collective trauma into a tactical blueprint for revenge. As the June heat intensified, Elias faced his greatest challenge, incorporating 3 newcomers into the conspiracy who had been selected for the race but knew nothing of the plan. Arthur, a veteran of 8 years, Lazarus, whose hand was mutilated from a mill accident, and Micah, a terrified teenager fresh from a Mississippi auction block. Elias took a monumental risk, approaching each man privately to offer them the same choice: die as a piece of property for the entertainment of wealthy men, or die as a warrior fighting for a chance at a different world. He spoke to Micah not of freedom, but of the mother the boy had just lost, fueling his grief into a cold, sharp anger. He spoke to Lazarus of the fingers he had lost and the lack of value the judge placed on his broken body. One by one, the newcomers chose the path of resistance. The group was now 13 strong, a small but unified force bound together by a shared understanding that their lives were already forfeit, which gave them a terrifying kind of power that no slave owner could ever truly comprehend. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the judge, in a fit of sadistic hubris, announced a change to the rules for the 8th annual gauntlet. Inspired by a guest from Mississippi, Thorne decided that the selected men would be allowed to spend the afternoon before the race unchained and well-fed. His twisted logic was that by providing a fleeting taste of hope and physical strength, the psychological torture of the hunt would be amplified. He believed that men who had spent hours contemplating their possible escape would run harder and fight more desperately, providing better sport for the paying audience who had wagered over $50,000 on the outcome. When Cora brought word of this to Elias, he didn't feel the fear the judge intended. Instead, he felt a grim, surging satisfaction. The judge had unknowingly handed them the one thing they needed most: the time and physical freedom to position themselves. "That is when we strike," Elias whispered to the others. The stage was set, the weapons were buried, and the hunters were arriving, never dreaming that their invitation to a massacre was actually a summons to their own funeral. The morning of June 15th dawned with a heavy, oppressive stillness, as if the Texas landscape itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the carnage to come. Carriages of polished mahogany and brass began to choke the long, oak-lined drive of Deadwood Creek, carrying the most powerful men of the South toward their annual pilgrimage of cruelty. They arrived from the bayous of Louisiana, the red clay hills of Georgia, and the sprawling estates of South Carolina, bringing with them a retinue of servants, specialized hunting hounds, and rifles that were masterpieces of lethal engineering. The air on the plantation grounds soon became thick with the scent of expensive tobacco, roasting game, and the sharp, medicinal tang of high-proof bourbon. These men, planters like Richard Beaumont and Henry Caldwell, saw no contradiction in their refined manners and the barbaric wager they had come to settle. They discussed the Midnight Gauntlet with the same casual expertise they applied to horse racing or cotton futures, debating the endurance of prime stock while sipping chilled mint juleps on the judge's shaded veranda. By midday, the betting pool had reached a staggering $52,000 in gold coin and banknotes, a king's ransom placed upon the systematic destruction of 13 human lives. In a move of calculated psychological warfare, Judge Thorne ordered the 13 selected men to be moved to a holding pen at the very edge of the cypress swamp. True to his word, they were left unchained, though a quartet of overseers stood on a raised platform nearby, their rifles resting across their laps with casual menace. The men were provided with rations of cornbread and actual salt pork, a mockery of a final meal designed to give them just enough strength to provide a vigorous chase. The judge believed that by granting them a few hours of physical freedom and nutrition, he was sharpening the edge of their eventual despair. He wanted them to contemplate the distance to the horizon, to weigh the possibility of escape, and then to feel the crushing weight of reality when the hounds were finally loosed. Among the men, the silence was heavy, but it was not the silence of the defeated. Elias sat in the center of the group, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line where the water met the sky. He was not looking for an escape route. He was visualizing the ambush points Cato had mapped and the caches of steel Gabe had buried beneath the mud. Before we move into the heart of this harrowing night and witness the moment the world of Deadwood Creek was turned upside down, I want to pause and ask, where in the world are you watching from today? The history we discuss here is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and I'd love to know which corner of the globe is joining us for this story. Also, if you find value in these deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It ensures you never miss a chapter of these incredible stories of resistance and survival. Now, let us return to that humid Texas night in 1856, where the lantern light was beginning to flicker against the encroaching shadows, and the judge was preparing to fire the shot that would change everything. The men in the pen were ready, their fear transformed into a cold, clinical focus that the overseers, in their boundless arrogance, completely failed to notice. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruise-like shades of purple and deep orange, Elias gathered the men for a final, whispered briefing. He moved from man to man, his voice a low vibration that barely carried past the wooden slats of the pen. To Josiah he spoke of speed. To Gabe he spoke of the hidden blades. To Micah he spoke of courage. They knew the plan by heart. They would not scatter into the deep swamp as the hunters expected. Instead, they would utilize the 15-minute head start to circle back toward the eastern and western flanks, creating a pincer formation that would draw the hunters into the most treacherous terrain. Cora and the house staff had already done their part, ensuring the kennel guards were distracted and the judge's primary guests were sufficiently intoxicated to impair their judgment, but not their confidence. The 13 men were no longer a group of panicked fugitives. They were a tactical unit. They watched as the hunters began to assemble at the starting line, their expensive lanterns casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws against the dark backdrop of the ironwood trees. The atmosphere at the starting line was festive, almost carnivalesque. Dozens of wealthy men gathered in a semicircle, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of torches. The hounds, sensing the bloodlust of their masters, strained at their leashes, their baying a haunting, guttural sound that echoed through the swamp. Judge Thorne stood atop his custom-built observation platform, looking down at his stock with the pride of a man who believed he was the master of destiny itself. He checked his gold pocket watch, the clicking of the mechanism the only sound in the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with whiskey-soaked authority, "the stakes have never been higher, and the sport has never been finer. You have 15 minutes to give these men a lead before the real entertainment begins. May your aim be true and your winnings be plentiful." He raised a silver-plated dueling pistol toward the moonless sky. The crack of the shot shattered the silence, and the 13 men sprinted into the darkness of Deadwood Creek, leaving behind the laughter of the elite for the silent, waiting embrace of the swamp. The transition from the torchlit arena of the manor lawn to the absolute obsidian darkness of the Deadwood Creek swamp was like stepping into the throat of a colossal beast. As the 13 men plunged into the knee-deep water, the air grew thick with the cloying sense of sulfur, stagnant water, and ancient, rotting vegetation. Elias led the column, his movements economical and fluid, a stark contrast to the splashing, panicked retreats of those who had come before him in previous years. He didn't allow the group to run at full tilt. To do so would be to invite exhaustion and clumsy noise. Instead, they moved with a predatory grace, their feet finding the submerged ridges of firm clay that Cato had identified weeks prior. The 15-minute head start was not a gift of mercy from the judge, but a tactical window Elias used to reach the first of their buried caches. Behind them, the distant roar of the crowd faded, replaced by the rhythmic chirping of cicadas and the heavy, wet slop of their own progress. The 13 were no longer a collection of stock. They were a ghost unit, moving through a terrain that had already begun to claim its first psychological victims among the younger, less experienced hunters waiting on the shore. When the second gunshot cracked across the property at 9:15 p.m., signaling the release of the hounds, the atmosphere in the swamp shifted from eerie silence to a cacophony of terror. Elias signaled for the group to split according to the plan they had rehearsed in the flickering shadows of the cabins. Josiah, the powerhouse of the group, led a detachment toward the western marshes, while Gabe and Obadiah headed for the central thickets where the cypress knees were most densely packed. Elias kept Judah, the veteran, and young Micah with him, circling back toward the eastern flank. They reached the lightning-struck cypress, a skeletal sentinel in the dark, and Elias reached into the hollow of its roots to retrieve 3 of Gabe's iron blades. As he handed a cold, heavy piece of steel to Micah, he could feel the boy's hands trembling, not with the desire to flee, but with the raw adrenaline of a cornered animal realizing it now has claws. They didn't move deeper into the swamp. They submerged themselves near a primary trail, the black water rising to their chins, masking their scent and their presence from anything but the most specialized tracker. The first hunter to enter their kill zone was a man named Preston Ashford, a wealthy heir from Mississippi who had wagered heavily on the speed of his pedigreed hounds. He rode with an arrogance that only comes from a lifetime of never being the one in the sights of a rifle. He moved carelessly through the water, his horse huffing and sidestepping the submerged roots, while Ashford swung a heavy lantern in wide arcs, searching for the glint of terrified eyes. He was so focused on the path ahead that he failed to notice the ripple in the water behind him. Elias rose from the muck like a vengeful spirit made of mud and shadow. There was no theatricality to the movement, only the brutal efficiency of a man who had planned this for months. One hand clamped over Ashford's mouth, silencing the sudden intake of breath, while the iron blade found the soft gap between the ribs. They pulled him from the saddle and into the water, holding him beneath the surface until the frantic thrashing ceased. One hunter was down, his silver-mounted rifle sinking into the mire, and the Midnight Gauntlet had officially claimed its first predator. The pincer movement Elias had designed began to close with terrifying precision. In the distance, the sounds of the hunt were changing. The rhythmic baying of the hounds was suddenly interrupted by sharp, high-pitched yelps as Gabe and his team engaged the lead dogs with weighted chains and sharpened poles. Cato, moving with the silence of a water moccasin, reached the edge of the stable fence where the secondary horses were tied. He didn't steal them, he simply cut their cinches and fired a single stolen pistol shot into the air, sending the high-strung animals bolting in every direction. The hunters, who relied entirely on their mobility and the coordination of their hounds, suddenly found themselves isolated in a labyrinth they didn't understand. Panic, that most contagious of emotions, began to ripple through the ranks of the elite. They started shouting to one another, their voices high and frantic, as they realized their quarry wasn't fleeing, it was hunting. The hunters began to cluster together for safety, exactly as Elias had predicted, turning themselves into a concentrated target for the final coordinated assault. The clearing near the center of the swamp, often used by hunters in previous years to regroup and share a flask of whiskey, became the site of the primary reckoning. 12 hunters, including the judge's most prominent guests, had gathered there, their lanterns huddled together like a dying star. They were reloading their rifles with shaking hands, swearing at the darkness and the ungrateful stock that had dared to fight back. From the shadows surrounding the clearing, 13 men emerged, not as the broken, exhausted prey the judge had envisioned, but as a unified front of survivors armed with the weapons of their oppressors. The exchange was short, violent, and absolute. The hunters, blinded by their own lanterns and paralyzed by the collapse of their perceived superiority, had no defense against the rage of men who had lived their entire lives under the lash. When the last shot echoed away into the cypress trees, the entertainment of the southern elite lay scattered in the mud, and the 13 survivors stood over them, the silence of the swamp returning. But this time, it was a silence born of liberation rather than death. The transition from the lightless, suffocating depths of the swamp to the burning periphery of the Deadwood Creek estate was like a descent into a new kind of underworld. Elias and the 11 remaining men, Amos and Lazarus having fallen during the brutal clash in the clearing, emerged from the tree line not as fugitives, but as a phalanx of shadows carved from the very muck of the Texas wilderness. The plantation, which hours ago had been a theater of aristocratic revelry, was now a hive of absolute chaos. The festive lanterns that were meant to guide the hunters home now served as beacons of panic, illuminating the frantic flight of the judge's guests. These men of status, who had arrived in polished carriages to witness a race, were now the ones stumbling through the dirt, their expensive silks stained with the terror of a reality they had never deemed possible. Elias looked at the grand torches lining the driveway, symbols of the Thorne family's enduring power, and realized they were the perfect tools for the final act of their liberation. They moved with a clinical, terrifying purpose toward the heart of the machine that had sought to grind them into nothingness. High atop his custom-built observation platform, Judge Horatio Thorne stood frozen, his silver flask slipping from his tremulous grip and clattering onto the floorboards. Through his brass spyglass, he had expected to see his hounds returning with the trophies of the night. Instead, he saw the stock he had discounted as broken, led by the man he had purchased for a pittance. The realization that his world was collapsing didn't come with a grand proclamation, but with the steady, rhythmic advance of 13 men who had discarded the shackles of fear. When Cato stepped into the flickering light of the yard, he didn't hesitate. Aiming a stolen percussion rifle with the practiced steadiness of a man who had spent years observing the weaknesses of his masters, he fired a single, echoing shot. The architect of the Midnight Gauntlet was thrown backward from his perch, his body falling into the dust among the betting ledgers and discarded champagne glasses. His death was unceremonious and swift, a sudden, violent punctuation mark at the end of a life defined by the measured, profitable suffering of others. As the judge fell, the plantation ignited, not just with literal fire, but with the explosive surge of 100 souls who had been waiting for this exact signal. Cora led the house staff in a coordinated strike from within the manor, utilizing the very tools of domestic service to neutralize the remaining overseers who had retreated to the kitchens in a daze of confusion. The 147 enslaved people of Deadwood Creek, who had been catalogued in ledgers as mere inventory for generations, reclaimed their humanity in a single, roaring hour of defiance. They threw open the heavy oak doors of the storehouses, distributed the remaining grain and supplies, and gathered the horses that Cato had strategically scattered earlier in the night. The big house, that grand monument to opulence built on the broken backs of those it sought to erase, began to billow thick black smoke as the fires from the kitchen spread to the velvet curtains and mahogany furniture. In the flickering, hellish light of the uprising, the roles were finally and irrevocably reversed. The masters were the panicked prey, and the survivors were the masters of their own destiny. In the judge's private study, amidst the swirling smoke and the pungent scent of burning leather-bound law books, Elias found the heavy leather bags containing the $52,000 prize for the night's blood sport. The survivors gathered around him, their soot-stained faces illuminated by the orange glow of the encroaching flames that were already consuming the Thorne family legacy. For a moment, a heavy silence hung between them. Some looked at the gold and thought of the lives they could buy in a distant land or the safety they could secure for their families. But Elias, looking at the blood-stained ledgers that recorded the names of the 70 men who had perished in the swamp in years past, felt only a profound sense of disgust. He grabbed the first bag and hurled it into the center of the growing blaze. "We are not here to trade one master for another," he declared, his voice ringing over the crackle of the fire and the distant shouts of the fleeing elite. "We are not thieves. We are men who have paid our debt in blood." One by one, the others followed his lead, watching as the gold that had been wagered on their destruction melted into an unrecognizable slag, proving that their lives were beyond any earthly price. As the first, bruised light of dawn began to gray the eastern horizon, the survivors of Deadwood Creek turned their backs on the smoking ruins of their former lives. They did not leave as a single, vulnerable mass, but as organized groups of free people, utilizing the horses and supplies they had liberated to begin the long, perilous journey toward the Rio Grande and the promise of a different law south of the border. Behind them, the story of the Midnight Gauntlet would transform from a whispered rumor of the southern aristocracy into a terrifying legend of the oppressed, a cautionary tale that would haunt every plantation owner for generations to come. The property was never rebuilt, the land itself becoming a cursed place where the wind through the cypress trees was said to carry the names of the 70 men the swamp had once claimed. Elias, the man who had been bought for $800, led his people into the wilderness with a cold, clear focus, knowing that while the path to true freedom was paved with hardship, they would never again be the prey in another man's game. The hunters were gone, the warriors remained, and the legend of the night the hunters became the hunted had only just begun.